Hey everybody, Ken here. Just wanted to take time today to discuss in our time together, how does psychology and spirituality come together? Today I want to talk about the brain and neurobiology, how the brain processes that information and how that information informs our relationships. And so today, um, as I said, how does the mind work? And then how does that influence our unhealthy behaviors? And then from there, how do our unhealthy behaviors affect our relationships? And then how do our relationships help us get us unstuck? And so you kind of see this cycle or this connectedness with all of that. And so on the first slide here, just to give a brief description of how the brain works, as information is coming into the brain, it hits the sort of reptilian older part of our brain, in the base of our brain. This is where you know information. This is fight, flight, freeze. This is our reactivity portion of our brain. From there, it moves up into the limbic system, and this is the area of the mind or the brain that this is how I feel. This is how do I feel about that information that's coming into our brain. And then up in the cortex and in the higher regions of the brain, this is how we think rationally about that, or how do I make sense of that information and how I feel about that information. It's more slow, more methodical way of processing that data. And so to give an example, a healthy brain functions in an integrated way. So in other words, all three of these systems within our mind, within our brain, are functioning together to help us make well-rounded, informed, and healthy decisions. And so as I was thinking about this and processing this, it really reminded me of this Maslow's theory. So if you see on the right side here, this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the way this works is, just to explain this very briefly, we are designed, the way our minds work, based on the model to the left, we function and take care of our physiological and safety needs first. So in other words, I can't think about or develop my sense of self-esteem if I don't have safety, if I don't have food on the table, if I don't have a roof over my head. And so that sort of describes the process of how we think about our health internally. And so as I was thinking about how the mind works, I was thinking about Maslow's theory, and using this as a metaphor of climbing an actual mountain. My family and I are watching Lost right now, and we're watching the season in Patagonia. And one of the contestants climbs to the top of the mountain to sort of get a view of the valley below. And in doing so, they can see the river, they can see how the river winds through the valley, they can see dangers. But more importantly, they can see the payoff of facing those dangers and pressing through those dangers. So that would be, as an example, someone who's functioning in the self-actualized triangle of Maslow's theory. They have a greater sense of what they know and what they feel and how they make meaning of that information, right? So if they have 2 days worth of rations and pressing through the danger is the only way to make their rations last to the other side, they can see and evaluate that. And again, I'm speaking metaphorically. But now think, there's another contestant that only climbed a part way up the mountain and maybe made it past the tree line. So they saw the same valley, they saw the same dangers, they saw the river bend, but what they didn't see is the payoff for facing that danger. And so I can imagine these two people, someone living maybe in the more self-actualized part, or a more integrated brain, right, where they're making sense of what they know, what they feel, and how they think about it, versus someone who's sort of stuck in that safety physiological part of Maslow's triangle, right? That person's maybe only climbed part of the way up the mountain. Having a conversation about the same topic, using the same vocabulary, and still feeling like maybe they're both speaking a different language. And so as I was thinking about that and why that is and how that is and so on and so forth, our trauma creates this sort of negative feedback loop. And so what I mean by that is our decisions are reactive and uninformed. When you live in that sort of state of, or grow up in that sort of state of stress or trauma, you don't have the ability, or your brain doesn't develop the maturity of the more rational, logical side of your brain. And so all of the information that is coming through is viewed through the lenses of of trauma or creating safety and security. And so our decisions become reactive and uninformed. Again, think about the man who's only climbed maybe halfway up the mountain, right? So our behaviors, we first think about, we behave first and then we think later. These reactions are embedded into our implicit memory. And so just to pause here, the difference between explicit and implicit memory. Explicit memory is I know trees are green. I know my kids' names. That's the knowledge piece, right? I know data. I know information. Implicit memory is, see, I'm walking down the street and I hear a buzz fly by my ear and I immediately dodge or duck. Why do I do that? Well, because I know bees buzz, bees sting, and stings hurt. Well, how do I know that so quickly? It's probably what's happening is your brain is recalling the trauma of your first bee sting. So the brain is designed to work so efficiently that it recalls the feeling of the moment as opposed to the details of the moment itself, right? So the bee buzzes by, you know you're going to get stung, and you dodge without even think about it. It becomes our response or a reflex, right? And so in that, the same can happen for us emotionally, right? When we're exposed to traumas, I come across a piece of information, I interpret it, it looks familiar, sounds familiar as that trauma or that stressor from early on. And so I react, and it creates stress and anxiety in my life, which triggers that fight flight response to my brain, which triggers more anxiety and stress, which triggers more fight, flight, freeze. And so you get this cycle, of this sort of negative feedback loop where you kind of get that stuckness, right? And so that creates sort of a bit of a paradox of change. How do we get unstuck? Well, getting unstuck requires change. Change is new. Change is scary. Scary triggers that stuckness, right? So think of another example would be like a Vietnam vet who is walking down the street and hears a car backfire and dives into the bushes. The car backfiring sounds like a gun, but it's not a gun, right? Again, the same can happen for us emotionally, where we experience something that's not the trauma, but feels like the trauma. And so we emotionally dive into the bushes. And so that creates that negative feedback loop, creates this sort of paradox of change, which the very thing that brings us health, which is change, is the very thing that keeps us stuck into old patterns. So that need to create safety and security causes us to avoid change, essentially. So from that perspective, change requires an external input to fix a broken system. So what do I mean by that? If you think about unhealth, and again, using scriptures, the sins of the father being passed down from generation to generation, there's a very psychological process to that. I can grow up in a family with an alcoholic father who abuses my mother, and not experience the abuse myself, but I simply am an observer to it. When I grow up, I can then reenact that same type of abuse on my wife, on my kids, and so on and so forth. So all I have to do in an unhealthy system is to be an observer to it. That's what I mean by unhealth can happen in a vacuum. Health is not the same way. You can take that same unhealthy person and transplant them into a healthy environment, and they watch healthy behaviors all day, every day. But that observation of healthy behavior is not enough to get them unstuck. It takes an external force. So that broken system must submit to the guidance of someone external, someone who has already walked the road of health. Our brains are built for community and built for a strong need of being discipled. So again, think of that Maslow's theory, that person climbing the mountain. And this isn't like a hierarchical metaphor where one is better than the other or anything like that. That's not what I'm trying to say. But think about like trailblazing, someone who's gone before you, who's walked the road to health, who's cut down the trees. They know the way up the mountain, and they're coming alongside of you, walking you through that process to helping you get to that place. That sort of describes that process of discipleship, right? So change requires a cognitive decision to move in spite of our fears, not in absence of them. I love this saying because, change in our life requires, it's going to cause fear. It's going to cause anxiety, but that anxiety can still drive us forward to new ways of action and new ways of health, and does not have to hold us back. And so how do we create that positive feedback loop in view of our community, right? So I came up, and I think the answer for that might be different for everybody, but I came up with these 3 questions that I thought would be great for us to sort of apply to our own personal lives, to meditate on. How does the mind inform our unhealthy actions? And then from there, how do those unhealthy actions affect our relationships? So what we're doing, that process is of, again, back to the diagram of the brain. You're taking that emotional reactivity that's getting stuck in that negative feedback loop, and you're pulling it out of that part of the brain into the cognitive side of the brain, or the cortex, right? So asking yourself these 2 questions and sort of meditating on it and walking through, maybe journaling about it, is just sort of bringing an awareness and beginning to practice in a very practical way of thinking rationally, or in that more executive part of your brain, and applying some logical thinking to it. And then from there, how do my relationships help get me unstuck? Who are those people in my community that have walked this road, who have gone before us, that can help come alongside me, and maybe share those realizations for yourself, and walk through those relationships, walk through those conversations within those relationships. And I think that's such a beautiful description of maybe a process of discipleship. And so before I end, I'll leave you with this Philippians passage, which I think sums up our time together beautifully. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the peace of God will be with you. And this is Paul writing to the Philippians. And I think that's such a beautiful passage that describes that process of discipleship, where someone has come alongside of the person writing this letter, and now that person is writing a letter to a group of people where he is coming alongside of them and saying, hey, here's what I've learned in my walk up that mountain. Here are the things that I've discovered, and imitate those things as I imitate Christ to more healthy ways of living. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to talking to you next time.